turn to digital marketing to advertise their products and increase brand representation. Brenda Kirubo, KTN News.
To the moment you've all been waiting for. As I mentioned earlier, this whole week here on KTN and KTN News, we are running a special coverage of the Constitution at 10, speaking to key players, key voices in the clamor for constitutional change, then those who were charged with implementing it, and of course those who played an integral part in the writing of the Constitution. And one of them is here with me tonight. When you talk about the Bomas draft, we talk about the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, and your name definitely comes up. You're also the first Deputy Chief Justice under the new constitutional dispensation. Very, very big voice in terms of constitution and matters constitution. Thank you very much, Dr. Nancy Baraza, for joining us here tonight.
You're welcome.
This week, we are looking at 10 years since the promulgation of the Constitution. It's been a long journey that dates way back. Let's just start us off for the sake of our viewers. Where have we come from? And where are we now?
We've come from far. The clamor for a new constitutional dispensation started in the late 80s, and people fought because of the limited democratic space that had been created at that time. Remember, the Independence Constitution of 1963 had contained some very good guarantees for constitutionalism, but then it had been amended so many times within that short period. Right. And some of the things that had been removed from that constitution were devolution, for example. We had devolution in the 1963 constitution. We had checks and balances had been interfered with. Parliament and judiciary were subservient to the executive. There was a creation of what was then called the imperial presidency, and limited space for enjoyment of human rights. The democratic space had shrunk, and so people started to clamor for multi-party democracy. Right. That was in the late 80s, but it gained momentum. And with the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the wind of change blowing all over the world, we also got caught up in it. And so there was the repeal of Section 2A of the then Constitution in the early 90s, I think 1992 or something around there. But then that didn't satisfy people. Now it's morphed into a bigger demand by the Kenyans for constitutional reforms, for constitutional change that would usher in a new constitutional dispensation. Right. Yes, and it gained momentum. A few hitches along the road, a few attempts at improving the situation. For example, the 1997 IPPG by Parliament, and then, but people still clamored for an overhaul of our constitutional dispensation. And 1998 saw the enactment of the first Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Act, which would provide a framework for undertaking reforms for a new constitution. Okay.
So then we come into the early 2000s, and it's gained momentum, as you mentioned. I want you to talk about the coming up with the Bomas draft, the amendments thereafter, and now even with the clamor for change, it looks like most of the suggestions are bringing us back to the Bomas draft. What was it with this document?
The Bomas draft was undertaken under the 2000 the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Act, which under which a commission was appointed to undertake the reforms. It enabled the merger between the then government process and the People's Commission under the Ufungamano initiative. And so it brought together a commission of 27 commissioners, and I was privileged to serve as a member in that commission. And we undertook massive exercises, civic education around the country, and mobilized Kenyans, and eventually collected their views up to constituency levels. It is said to be perhaps the most participatory process that any country in the world has undertaken to get a new constitution. So it was very participatory. All Kenyans of all walks of life participated. And after we had collected the views, then we collated them and then produced the first draft.
Right.
Yes.
So then, where are we now? I'd like us to look at where we are now. A lot happened between the Bomas draft to the Wako draft and even to the 2010 constitution that many would feel was watered down with the political space. You'll speak to us on that. But looking at where we are now, have we done justice to this document?
The document which came out to become the 2010 constitution emerged out of the Bomas and the Wako draft. You remember the Wako draft, which tinkered with the Bomas draft. And the Bomas draft, Kenyans considered it their document because they made it at Bomas. It contained what they liked. It contained their aspirations. But then, due to political interests of the time, then emerged the Wako draft or the Cliffy draft, which tried to make changes to the Bomas draft. And of course, it was rejected at the 2005 referendum. And so that left us in limbo until we drove ourselves into that catastrophe of the post-election violence of 2007.
All right.
Yes. And so a committee of experts was appointed now to continue with the process, to look at contentious issues, and it is that committee which now gave us the draft that became the 2010 constitution.
From where you sit, the implementation of this 2010 constitution, are we on the right track with it? Have we made any progress for the 10 years we've had it?
The constitution is a good document, reasonable document that could have taken this country very far. The problem has been implementation. There hasn't been sufficient implementation. There has been little respect for some of its provisions. But I argue that if we had been serious with implementing this constitution, we would have gone very far. It guarantees us so many things. It guarantees us a democratic country, the rule of law. It has good checks and balances. It has a very robust Bill of Rights, which guarantees and promises Kenyans so many things: right to water, right to health, right to education, right to shelter, access to national resources in an equitable manner, devolution, which would take resources nearer to the people and governance nearer to the people. It had Chapter 6, very good Chapter 6, which would have guaranteed good governance and dealt with corruption, which is actually the main enemy for the implementation of the Constitution. And it still remains a very good Constitution.
A lot of the things you mentioned, devolution, a Bill of Rights, that you drafted yourself, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And Chapter 6 on leadership and integrity, perhaps one of the chapters that is seen as the most disregarded in our Constitution. What do you think is our major setback? What's holding us back from implementing this document?
It's because we have just chosen, the people who are meant to implement the Constitution have chosen not to implement the Constitution.
Is it lack of political goodwill?
Lack of political goodwill, greed. And I argue that we put new wine into old wine skins, okay? So that if you look at the Constitution and the things that I have mentioned, those are things which even call into question our moral character. Chapter 6, a very, very moral chapter. Integrity, accountability. But we've disregarded all those provisions. Okay. So we haven't implemented.
You drafted the Bill of Rights.
No, I oversaw.
The draft, yes. Thank you for correcting that.
Yes, I chaired the committee that crafted the Bill of Rights. Yes.
What was the vision of it? And are we living through the spirit of the writers of it?
The Bill of Rights is touted, and rightly so, as one of the best in the world. It guarantees us so many fundamental rights and individual freedoms, rights which never existed before: the socio-economic rights, rights of women, rights of children, rights of youth, rights of people with disability, rights of marginalized people, people who had really been marginalized in the previous constitutional dispensation. So it is a very robust Bill of Rights. It guarantees, it calls for affirmative action for marginalized people, including women. But again, it remains on paper to a large extent. But if we had implemented it, this country would be good. But I think, as I have said, we put new wine into old wine skins. This constitution, for example, the Bill of Rights and all those rights listed under it, we needed to do an introspection on how we spend our resources, on how we treat each other. But the status quo remained, in the sense that we never sat down to question ourselves, how are we going to meet these demands in the Constitution? It meant we had to change the way we spend our resources. It means we had to change the way we distribute resources. But status quo continued. People continued to live big, like nothing changed, and the rest of the people remain poor and provided for.
And like that you mentioned status quo, because we now see a clamor for amendments of this constitution, a referendum perhaps maybe next year, just before the election. The conversation is whether it should be before elections, during elections, or after. Do you think it's time to change the constitution? Do you think this is the solution to what bedevils the country?
They have not implemented the constitution. What is it they want? I have looked at the proposals in BBI. Most of them are policy issues. So if they are serious on implementing the constitution, this constitution is still very good. But they haven't implemented it. And they are talking of a constitutional moment. Constitutional scholars would cringe to hear of that. The constitutional moment came at the time when Kenyans clamored and got the 2010 constitution. Right now, it's a clamor by a section of people. You can't sit in a corner and create a constitutional moment. And this one, I tell you, constitutional scholars take constitutional moment very, very seriously.
One of the big issues, and one of the things that comes out very clearly in the BBI is that perhaps the country is ripe to go the parliamentary system way of governance, that the winner takes it all is one of the things that makes our elections very contentious and very competitive. What's interesting is most of those who are in support of a parliamentary system were part of the process of I'd like to say watering down the Bomas draft that had these very same recommendations. Speak to us about the politics then and now, given that we are still trying to go back to some of those recommendations from the Bomas draft that we would have adopted then.
The Bomas draft is the best constitution that Kenyans never had. In the sense that these things they are clamoring for, the parliamentary system of government, Kenyans gave it to themselves through the Bomas draft. Okay? Then, through the stages of harmonization, the exercise that the Committee of Experts carried out, the document they produced still had the parliamentary system of government. But then that document was taken to Naivasha to be discussed by politicians and parliamentarians. And the loudest now saying they want parliamentary are the ones who caused the removal of the parliamentary system of government. All of us were so shocked and horrified at some of the people who looked on at Naivasha as parliamentary system was removed. So I think Kenyans are subjected to politics of convenience, depending on the political environment and circumstances. Then politicians just, keep running Kenyans around. Personally, I think Kenyans are tired. They could have gone very far. That parliamentary, we don't even know if they will end up agreeing and giving it to us, or they will play games again the way they did. But Bomas gave Kenyans that system of government.
Something else that's key and perhaps borrowed from the Bomas draft, and I'll keep referring to that, the formation of 14 economic blocks, regional blocks. We are seeing that as one of the recommendations in the BBI. When we were coming up with this in 2004 with the commission that you served under, what were we envisioning? And with now 47 counties, what does that mean for us?
The original draft, the Bomas draft, there is a departure from it by the 2010 constitution, which gave us the 47, because of the debates around it. People rejected the regional blocks. And actually, it became one of the contentious issues that the Committee of Experts was later to deal with. Now, this, the system of devolution in place now seems to be serving people well. I don't see where the ordinary Kenyans are complaining that they want regional blocks, which were extremely contentious. In any event, don't we need that money to apply to the basic needs of Kenyans? Kenyans are poor. Kenyans are hungry. Kenyans are so poor, you weep for them. And then we want to spend more money creating more bureaucracies. I personally haven't seen a good reason as to why we should go add another layer. All right? Why don't we implement this? Why don't we give sufficient funds to the devolved units as they are now? As we speak, they are almost getting starved of resources. Yeah. But when you go down to those levels, to the devolved units, people are happy. Power has been brought there close to them. Governance has been brought close to them. The national resources have been brought close to them, if they were not being stolen through corruption, that is. So I really don't know what the pressure is for extra blocks. And of course, it means an extra cost being put on Kenyans.
Generally, do you think a referendum is a good idea currently?
Oh, if there are some provisions in that constitution which you cannot change without going for referendum. And one of them is the system of government. The issue of parliamentary system or presidential system. So that has to go to referendum. And it means Kenyans will be thrown into a referendum, all right? I hear they are saying it is only 2 billion. I wish they could see Kenyans. People are suffering. People have no food. I don't know if they watch TV and listen to these very, very sad stories of women cooking stones to cheat their children that food is coming. 2 billion will go a long way, especially in this time of COVID.
So we don't have too much time. We have to wind up. We are here now, 10 years on, this clamor for change. A lot of questions around the implementation of this document. What's the way forward for us as a country? How do we move forward?
Government, please implement the constitution. This constitution is good. The things you are talking about equitable resources, equitability, I don't know, they are all in that constitution. Why don't you implement what we already have before you clamor for change? Right? Implementation has been a problem to an otherwise good constitution. Yeah.
One of the things it's set to cure is divisive elections. Why do you think our elections are this contentious? Is there anything in this document that can help us solve this? Or is it a leadership issue?
Who creates these problems about divisive election? They are the same politicians. Kenyans say, here is a parliamentary system of government. It will cure the first past the post system that creates the winner gets it all or takes it all system. And then among themselves, then they remove it. Then they are the ones now crying to say, this is what we need. But Kenyans had actually proposed a system, in fact, a system of proportional representation that could have cured the current problems that we have. So partly it is the system, but partly it's our own greed for power and opportunism.
Right. You have served in the judiciary, and the last time we saw the Chief Justice in public, and this would be my last question, he was lamenting frustration from the executive. The separation of powers principle and what it has stood for all these years, we are seeing a lot of push and pull among these arms of government. What are your thoughts on that as we wrap it up?
Again, one of the reasons that Kenyans clamored for a new constitutional order was the lack of checks and balances, the disregard for the principle of separation of powers. The parliament and the judiciary had been made subservient to the executive, which rode roughshod over all of them. And the judiciary, one of the reasons that the powers to appoint judges was removed from the executive was for purposes of creating these checks and balances. And so we are at a stage where, for example, the appointment of the 42 judges appointed by the Judicial Service Commission, which is an independent commission in the Constitution created for purposes of taking away the appointment powers from the executive, which Kenyans didn't want. And so now there we are stuck, which, according to me, is a problem. If we respect the Constitution, then let the president appoint those judges. If he has adverse evidence against some of them, then they can start the process of their removal. But right now, doing otherwise is going counter to the provisions of the Constitution.
Right. Thank you very much. I wish we could continue this conversation. Not a lot of time on our side, but thank you for joining us here on Checkpoint. Dr. Nancy Baraza, Lady Justice Dr. Nancy Baraza, former Deputy Chief Justice, former Commissioner at the defunct Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, and a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi School of Law. Thank you for joining us here on Checkpoint. Remember, we continue with the coverage of the Constitution at 10.